Why is Hiromi Higuruma such a compelling character?
私だけは目を開けていたい。
The answer is very simple.
全員戻れ。あり直しだ。
It's because he feels real. This detail isn't only reflected in his character arc, but also the episode he's introduced in. It was storyboarded and directed by Yosuke Takata, so give this man his flowers. Cinematic angles and a grounded everyday color palette mixed with a subdued soundtrack paint Higuruma as a fairly mundane lawyer. Just a man who's trying to do what's right. Ever so often taking cases that seem unwinnable, he tries everything he can to bring salvation to those who need it. But with every loss, the cracks begin to show. Every good man sent behind bars having that same disdain for their lawyer who promised them freedom, promised them justice. His disillusionment with Japan's justice system is tragic because it isn't something that Gege Akutami made up. It's a very real problem. Japan's 99.9 conviction rate sounds good on paper. It gives the impression that crime doesn't pay and that justice is consistently delivered. A stark contrast to the kinds of scandals that are happening elsewhere in the world, like everything surrounding certain files that we'll leave unnamed. But behind that near-perfect statistic lies a darker truth. Because when a system is expected to win almost every case, it begins to prioritize convictions over justice, which raises an uncomfortable question. How did Japan's conviction rate become so high in the first place? And that's also a very simple answer. It stems from Japan's culture. You see, Japan's modern legal system was shaped during the Meiji Restoration under the Meiji Constitution, where courts functioned in the emperor's name and legal officials functioned as extensions of the state. Although the post-war constitution of Japan made the emperor symbolic, the systems retained a deeply hierarchical culture that valued institutional stability and deference to authority. This environment discourages prosecutors from pursuing cases they might lose and makes courts reluctant to challenge investigations, helping sustain Japan's extremely high conviction rate. In other words, the system emphasizes strong institutional commitment and respect for authority. This theme of rigid hierarchy is also reflected throughout the story of Jujutsu Kaisen. The Jujutsu higher-ups control major decisions and expect obedience from those below them. After Gojo is sealed, the elders immediately reinstate Itadori's death sentence and move to eliminate anyone who challenges their authority. The confrontation between Yaga and Gakuganji further demonstrates how even powerful figures are expected to follow orders from those above them.
なぜ戦わんわしが憎くないのか
俺にとっちゃあんたは落ちてるナイフみたいなもんさ
These moments highlight how the series critiques rigid authority and blind obedience. Understanding this theme raises an important question. How does similar hierarchical attitudes influence real-world institutions in Japan, such as its legal system and the high conviction rate? The year is 1968. After relentless interrogations that pushed a confession out of a former boxer, the fate of Iwao Hakamada was decided in a Shizuoka courtroom. Among the three judges presiding over the case was Norimichi Kumamoto, the youngest on the panel, who believed Hakamada was innocent, but he didn't speak out. Now, when I say the interrogation was relentless, I mean it. According to his lawyer, he was interrogated for a total of 264 hours, over 23 days, with some sessions lasting up to 16 hours. At his trial, Hakamada retracted his confession, testifying that police had kicked and clobbered him to force it. In doing so, he entered a plea of not guilty. He said, and I quote, "I could not do anything but crouch down on the floor trying to keep from defecating." He later told his sister, "One of the interrogators put my thumb into an ink pad, drew it to a written confession record, and ordered me, 'Write your name here,' while shouting at me, kicking me, and wrenching my arm." Hakamada maintained his innocence as he wrote to his son in 1983, "I will prove to you that your dad never killed anybody. And it is the police who know it best, and it is the judges who will feel sorry. I will break this iron chain and return to you." In 2007, nearly 40 years later, Norimichi finally spoke publicly about the 1968 death sentence of Hakamada. He admitted that during the trial, the two senior judges had already concluded Hakamada was guilty, and as the junior judge, he felt immense pressure not to oppose them, believing it would be shameful to challenge their authority. He wrote a 360-page document detailing the inconsistencies in the case and still sentenced him to death. He later resigned because he couldn't bear the shame. The aftermath of this case would stretch on for decades. Hakamada spent nearly half a century imprisoned, much of it on death row and in solitary confinement, becoming one of the longest serving death row inmates in the world. Years later, new evidence cast serious doubt on the confession and the prosecution's case, eventually leading to his release and a retrial. What began as a near-certain conviction slowly unraveled, turning the case into one of Japan's most powerful symbols of the dangers behind a system defined by near-perfect certainty. As of 2024, he has been acquitted, 56 years after his initial arrest. Another example is the case of Sakea Menda. In 1946, he was accused of murdering a Buddhist priest and his wife in Hitoyoshi, Kumamoto Prefecture. Despite maintaining his innocence, he was subject to brutal interrogation, beaten with bamboo sticks, hung upside down, denied food, water, and sleep until he signed a confession he did not intend. The courts ignored his alibi and the lack of supporting evidence. By 1950, Menda was sentenced to death, and the Supreme Court upheld that verdict. For 34 years, he lived under the shadow of execution, confined to solitary death row isolation, with every day a reminder of a system that had failed him. Yet, he never stopped fighting. He filed retrial petitions repeatedly, and in 1983, his persistence paid off. The court overturned his conviction and he walked free, becoming the first person in Japan's history to be released from death row through a retrial. He then dedicated his life to speaking against the death penalty and sharing the brutal reality of coerced confessions and wrongful convictions, and reminded the world how easily the innocent can be destroyed by blind adherence to procedure. Cases like Hakamada and Menda show the dark reality behind Japan's near-perfect conviction rate, relentless interrogations, coerced confessions, and a legal culture that prioritizes hierarchy and authority over truth. Even when new evidence eventually exonerates the innocent, prosecutors often drag out appeals and challenge acquittals. It's this very tension between the ideal of justice and the authority that enforce it that make characters like Higuruma feel larger than life. His disillusionment isn't some fictional exaggeration. It's grounded in decades of real-life failures, and given the timeline that JJK takes place in, it's safe to assume that these cases did happen in that world. But there's a bit of irony within Higuruma. His curse technique embodies the same principle of the system he's critiquing. Inside it, he judges others with complete authority, deciding guilty and punishment in a way that reflects the coercion, hierarchy, and rigid convictions of the justice system he once opposed. In using this power, he acts like the very judges and prosecutors who sentence people like Iwao and Menda. His battle with Yuji reinforces this idea heavily. In this instance, Higuruma can be compared to Judge Norimichi Kumataro, who presided over Iwao Hakamada's trial and knew he was likely innocent, yet trapped by hierarchy and procedure, still allowed the death sentence to proceed.
Guilty! Confiscation! Death penalty!
Similarly, Higuruma knows that Itadori is innocent of murder, fully aware of the truth that Sukuna was responsible for Shibuya, and yet he still steps into that role of judge and proceeds with the death penalty. The crucial difference is that Higuruma breaks the cycle. He refuses to sentence an innocent man to death, consciously choosing to restrain where Kumamoto did not. In doing so, he becomes a reflection of the system's power and its danger, but also a rare example of judgment guided by conscience rather than procedure. It's really touching when he tells Yuji he went back to his roots. He truly did lose his way. It reminds me of what Yaga said early on in the series about becoming a jujutsu sorcerer. It's an unpleasant job. You have to be motivated and a little crazy. And that tracks, especially the crazy part. Consistently, we see sorcerers go feral or become damaged mentally in some way. Megumi, Nobara, Yuji, Geto, and most importantly, upon awakening, Gojo and Higuruma. This fact is even more apparent with Higuruma's trial of Kita Oe. I'm going to go through the trial just for you to understand how absurd it all is. In March 2016, authorities in Morioka City, Iwatawa Prefecture, responded to the discovery of two homicide victims, a mother and her daughter who were found stabbed to death inside their residence. During the course of this investigation, police questioned a local resident, Kita Oe. Authorities later pursued him to his apartment, where they discovered a blood-stained knife. Subsequent forensic testings revealed that the DNA on the blade matched that of the victims. Based on this evidence, Oe was arrested and charged by the local prosecutor's office on suspicion of murder and robbery. Oe asserted that the initial police questioning was improper, explaining that officers had approached him solely because he was an acquaintance of an individual who was using drugs. Regarding the knife discovered in his possession, Oe testified that he had found the weapon and intended to turn it over to the police. He explained that the non-profit organization he worked for had a strict internal policy, prohibiting employees from contacting police or emergency services. as doing so was believed to disturb nearby residents. According to Oe, this policy prevented him from immediately reporting the discovery of the knife. Although he was also accused of robbery, investigators found no stolen property connected to the victims inside of his residence or in his possession. Further complicating the case, another employee from the same non-profit went missing shortly after the murders were committed. Despite this, authorities did not pursue the individual as a primary suspect. Additionally, surveillance footage placed Oe at a convenience store during the time of the murder, providing evidence that could support an alibi. Through Higuruma's defense, the court determined the available evidence was insufficient to establish Oe's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As a result, he was acquitted of all charges. Following the acquittal, the prosecutor filed an appeal, resulting in a retrial. During the second trial, prosecutors did not introduce new evidence linking Oe to the murder. Nevertheless, the court ultimately reversed the earlier ruling and found him guilty. The reasoning relied in part on the assertion that there was insufficient reason to suspect the missing coworker from the non-profit organization as an alternative perpetrator. Based on this conclusion, the court determined that the existing evidence against Oe remained persuasive. As a result of the retrial, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. At that time, Higuruma hadn't yet awakened as a sorcerer, and the weight of the system hadn't fully shaped him. Seeing his client retried and found guilty crushed him. He had once opened his eyes to injustice, but after that day, he shut them, killing the judge and the prosecutor and abandoning the man he used to be. Yuji helps him reconnect with that former idealistic self. When he admits his guilt for killing, his eyes finally reopen as he begins to feel that conscience he thought he had lost.
最悪の気分だったろ。
If you like anything I had to say, please subscribe and like the video. Greatly helps out the channel.